Now I do. Okay, good. Thanks for the reminder. Okay. Awesome.
Welcome, welcome everyone.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming today.
Morning, Kelsey. Greta, Latra, hello.
Hey there.
Megan, Mitchell. Sadana, hello. Hera, good morning. Morning to Indonesia. Sven, good morning to Sweden.
It is evening here, like 6 p.m.
Okay. Well, here it's early in the morning.
Well,
We are upside down.
Thanks everyone for coming. Just give it a moment more while people trickle in. Thanks for those who are coming from time zones where this is very, very awkward. So
including the East Coast.
What?
Including the East Coast of the United States. So.
Yeah, it's early here for sure too. I mean, early, but not the middle of the night or something. But yes, I am not usually talking at 6 a.m.
Morning, Ander.
Good morning. Nice to see you all.
So welcome everyone. Do we see more coming in, or are we all in now, Trebor?
For now, that's it. I would assume, well, there are more people coming, but we should just move on. Right?
Sounds good. Well, welcome everyone to the research sprint presentations of work on data co-ops. We're so excited to have this presentation. It's the culmination of the work of these 12 research sprint participants. And you'll see here all of their names and who is speaking on the various topics. My name is Elizabeth Sylvan. I'm the managing director of the Berkman Klein Center. And in collaboration with Trebor and the Platform Cooperative Consortium, we've put together this research sprint program. That's a 10-week program in which students who are interested in the topic of platform cooperatives come together to learn and create some work outside of their usual class engagements. This is part of, for us, on the Berkman Klein side, Trebor will talk momentarily about the specifics of this sprint. This is an effort for us to engage earlier career scholars in the work areas in which we engage, and to support them in connecting with and engaging with not only the topics, but other people in the field. We hope today that you very much enjoyed the presentations. I, for myself, am so excited to see what is the culmination of the work of these three groups of scholars, and just to hear the presentations. So welcome. And with that, I'll turn the conversation over to Trebor, who will talk about the three topics here.
You mean like more about the topic of the research sprint, right? So yeah, I mean, there's a vast power imbalance in the data economy, and between the big American tech companies and the Chinese internet. At the conference in Berlin, we were just asking about perhaps a third way, right? That is not a third way for Europe, possibly, to address this power imbalance. And what over the last few months really has started is inquiry into data cooperatives and DAOs, especially at the intersection of DAOs and cooperatives, perhaps to answer that question. And one of the central questions there is how you can engage users in the sort of bottom-up participatory management of data. And we felt that there was a real promise in the 175 years of cooperative history in which cooperatives have done this on a very large scale, distributed over vast territories, engaging millions of people, in fact, roughly 1 billion people all over the world, right? So, but often this sort of framing of data cooperatives seemed quite uneasy because often what was addressed isn't really cooperatives. And so I felt that it was important to look a bit closer and actually really reiterate what a cooperative actually is and bring that to the discussion, and then also add to that this more recent discussion of data trusts, right, which is also part of this conversation. So how can we facilitate a participatory bottom-up data economy, right? And yeah, so the topics of the 3 working groups within our sprint focused on what DAOs can learn from platform co-ops, the second group focused on data cooperatives in Europe, legal and empirical investigation, and the question of certification of data cooperatives, or if I should say platform co-ops in general. It's a really interesting question. All of that in the context of a 6-day event, which is today concluding with a keynote by McKenzie Wark in the afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States. And so we had 6 days of programming. I just returned from 3 days in Berlin, where we met, many of us, for the first time in 3 years at any major event again, and very energized and very necessary meeting to come together at Humboldt University. You will see the documentation, the videos, and all this material we collected very, very soon. We will share it, right? So having said that, I will keep it brief as well. And I think hand it over to Valerie, who will just walk us briefly through the agenda, right, of the meeting today.
Yes, thank you, Trebor. You all are in for quite a treat. As we mentioned, the research sprint has a cohort group who we're actually in groups. So we've already gone through the welcome and introductions. And so you'll have a chance to hear from each group, and then even some time to ask them questions and engage with them about their specific projects. So we'll go through 2 groups, and then we'll have a break, a short break, and then we'll continue on with the final group and even have some time for some session discussion if we haven't answered it already. So I'm going to now then hand it over to our first group.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Valerie. Hello, everyone. We are really excited to be kicking things off today, and welcome to our presentation today on grounding decentralized technologies in cooperative principles, in which we explore the question, what can decentralized autonomous organizations and platform cooperatives learn from each other? And we're very much looking forward to sharing with all of you some of our emerging findings of this research that I undertook with my teammates, Kelsey, Megan, and Novita. Can we have the next slide, please, Valerie? Thank you. Before we get into the heart of our research question and into our emerging hypothesis and findings, I'd like to begin by giving you all a brief background to why we chose the topic that we did and to ground it in a bit of contemporary relevance. So there's been some growing evidence in the last few decades to suggest that market fundamentalism by itself has failed to ensure the equitable distribution of wealth or even enable participatory forms of governance. At the same time, we also see that currently digitalization in the data economy is driving global capitalist restructuring, forming new forms of accumulation, but underlying structural conditions of inequality, the concentration and accumulation of wealth continue to persist. In the digital economy, these can be identified with the governance of data and platform resources. We see that data has emerged as the central logic of accumulation in today's digital economy, and platforms as the architecture of value creation and distribution. So the governance of data and platforms thus emerge as crucial moments of reckoning, and the models that we choose today and the models that we discover through the course of our research will in fact determine the trajectory that the digital economy takes in the future. However, we see that existing governance frameworks for platforms and data currently suffer from a serious democratic deficit. In this context, there has been renewed interest in the cooperative movement as a means of resisting platform capitalism. However, in addition to the cooperative movement, there have also been modes of resistance that emerge from within frontier technology communities themselves. And one example is the promise of decentralized technologies, such as blockchain, that scaffold newer forms of organization and governance. The next slide, please. Thank you very much. So in our research that we've been undertaking over the last few weeks, we aim to explore some common challenges that traditional brick and mortar cooperatives, as well as newer forms of platform cooperatives, have had to contend with. We then introduced decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, as an institutional format that, much like cooperatives, aspire to similar forms of participatory governance and ownership for mutual benefit. We then conclude by identifying certain aspects of certain experiences that the DAO communities could benefit from, drawing on the wealth of experience that scholars and activists in the cooperative movement have acquired over decades. We then also identify aspects that platform cooperatives in turn can absorb from the DAO community in order to enable more governance maturity in the technology age and enable participatory governance for the digital economy. The next slide, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan, and I'm going to give you an introduction to DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, which are at their core a community of participants working towards a shared objective, leveraging technology to achieve scale. A DAO is a blockchain-based system that enables people to coordinate and govern themselves using a set of self-executing rules deployed on a blockchain. So the governance of a DAO is decentralized, being that is, it is independent from central control. And the principles of DAOs are based on the ideas of a loosely organized group called the cypherpunks, who influenced early thinking on public blockchains and autonomous organizations. So DAOs essentially scale social institutions through decentralized technologies and governance mechanisms, such as crypto economics, that align incentives, which could benefit platform cooperatives. However, from a governance perspective, DAOs face many of the same challenges as platform cooperatives. Moreover, DAOs do not have overarching fundamental operating principles like the platform co-op principles that are based off worker co-op principles. So, for example, unlike in a worker co-op, governors of DAOs are not necessarily workers in the organization. I am now going to hand over to Novita, who is going to talk us through some of the fundamentals of co-ops and some of the case studies that were conducted through this research. Next slide, please.
Yes, thanks, Megan. So we started our discussion with conducting literature review. Next slide, please, Valerie. Yeah. No, this one, I think. Before the slide, no, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, we're starting our discussion with conducting a literature review with several case studies, both in global north and also global south, to see the issues and challenges faced by traditional cooperatives. And we found out that as cooperatives scale, certain governance a deficit begins to emerge. And in terms of low member participations, efficiency of governance or decision making, and also free riding. As Johnston Birchall once stated, that it's too big to be governed. And we also found out that accountability and transparency, particularly in cooperatives in emerging economies, also become challenges, since there were many fraudulent actions occurred due to the lack of accountability and transparency in cooperatives. So then the question that emerged is whether is it possible to scale while also preserving members' interest and mitigating the effects of bad actors and free riders. Next slide, please. And Snichak popularized the term platform capitalism in 2016 to explain how technology changing the global economy into digital platform economy, but at the same time, it also creating social problems. So as a response, a growing number of researchers and practitioners are advocating for more equitable and also ethical alternatives, platform cooperatives. And basically platform cooperatives is cooperatives facilitated by digital platforms with shared ownership and democratic control over the platform. Next slide, please. Yes, as we know that we have the 7 principles of cooperatives and also some values by the ICA, and also Trebor promote 10th principle of platform cooperative, which link to fairer, inclusive digital economies and put worker rights at the central, and also worker cooperatives as a model for assisting platform capitalism. But however, there are also issues and challenges faced by a platform cooperative. So we took from 2 studies here. Philip in 2021, for example, he conducted case studies in five platform cooperatives in the Europe, and he found out that the governance, the complexity of the governance, and also the funding has become the main challenges of platform cooperative. So that's Puspasar and Restianto in 2020 in Indonesia. Case study also stated the same issues and challenges. Sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, so I have interviewed one founder of the platform cooperative, FediHelp.id, and he stated that they have like layers of challenges because they have to introduce technology to traditional pedicab drivers, but at the same time, they have to maintain the democratic practices among the members, among the founders, co-founders, and workers, or the pedicab drivers. And also at the same time, they have to gain revenue and run the business. So after 4 years, they failed in their efforts to juggling between everything. So accountability and transparency and governance have become the main challenges for both traditional and platform cooperatives. I will hand over to Kelsey.
Thanks, Navita. Next slide, please, Valerie. So my name is Kelsey, and it's my pleasure to talk us through some of our initial findings and I guess a forward-looking research agenda based on what we've done so far about what can DAOs learn from platform cooperatives and vice versa. And so these findings are deeply grounded in long-term ethnographic research, including digital ethnography and ethnographic interviews in the DAO space, and obviously everything we've garnered and learned from experience and through the course about cooperatives. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is that immature governance can lead to labor extractivism and free riders. And the example pointed out here is what is termed liquid democracy in decentralized autonomous organizations. And one example that we draw on for this model is a DAO called Gitcoin DAO, which provides public goods funding in the Ethereum ecosystem. And so the structure of this DAO is that there are governance token holders that received tokens through previous participation in the DAO, and they were awarded for their prior participation sort of retroactively by gaining governance tokens. But then these tokens can be delegated to what are stewards that actually participate in the day-to-day bureaucracy and administration of governance, including forum discussions and actually voting on matters that go to vote. But what this model has kind of unconsciously created is this two-tier system of a governance class and then a labor class that at any time can have the tokens delegated away from them and towards someone else, within or external to the system. It's not about just people that hold governance tokens. And so we see that some of these kind of quick to action governance solutions have actually created problems that, had they investigated the learnings from what Trebor mentioned of those previous 175 years of participatory governance practices, perhaps could have been avoided. A second observation is that DAOs could perhaps integrate cooperative care principles into their constitutions. So we all know the 7 principles of cooperatives that kind of are a guiding ethos for the broader movement. And what we're seeing in DAOs is that they're starting to be founded with all different values and objectives, but based on these constitutions that actually set out basic rules of kind of participation and respect kind of like terms and conditions of a digital platform. So we'd like to see some greater articulation there around kind of foundational governance practices to then guide future behaviours, governance design, governance mechanisms, and also sort of arbitration or dispute resolution. Thirdly, relations between co-ops and the experience around governance and participatory governance in this space could provide a blueprint for DAO to DAO relations, which is this very nascent research area about how DAOs can actually relate to one another and how they might find mutual interests and align incentives amongst DAOs. And so we sort of see that DAOs are continuously innovating these novel governance mechanisms, but there's no principled governance frameworks to orient the adoption of digital participatory organization. And so there's a lot that can be learned. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to explore the other side of this question too, in terms of what can platform cooperatives actually learn from DAOs. And so our view from the research that we've done is that DAOs can bring a number of potential opportunities to the co-op space as well. So one of these is kind of deep technical expertise. It's very software engineer dominant space in terms of blockchain communities more broadly, and rapid innovation. So there's a lot of talk and kind of pride about this sort of experimentation that is able to go on in DAO communities. Second is tools, so kind of greater efficiency through digital tools for things such as voting, as well as treasury management solutions. And this is something that came up actually with our peers in classwork, so such as multi-signature wallets that allow a number of people to manage a treasury and kind of co-sign on the movement of those funds for greater accountability, which Navita pointed out can be an issue in co-ops. And then finally, automation of payments through smart co-ops. So again, just kind of coming back to that, there's efficiency gains that we might want to see through digital participatory organizations. I'd like to hand to Megan to close out the discussion here.
Thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, so so in closing, we just want to raise the questions about, where to next. So we're considering taking this to the real world, creating potentially partnerships between the platform cooperative and decentralized technologies communities to create a breeding ground for learning through experimentation and application of our initial findings. And for example, testing the integration of principles of care as key components in DAO constitutions to promote maturity of their governance grounded in cooperative principles. And conversely, by assimilating technological governance innovations within platform cooperatives as an antidote to some of the common challenges that they face. And our final slide. Thank you. And yeah, we hope that you have enjoyed our presentation, and we look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
So I think we would take some questions now. If you want to post them now, that would be great. You can also start in the chat if you want, if you feel more comfortable asking a question there. And I think if all that is too early in the morning, we also have Adam perhaps with questions.
Hello, can you hear me? It's Nick Main here from Resonate Co-op.
Oh, hello, Nick.
Hi, I've just got a question about there are many tools and technologies available around this decentralized governance, and I was just wondering whether you encountered any attempts to standardize on behalf of the cooperative movement in an open standards-based way, or whether these are still, you find these as essentially proprietary initiatives from different blockchain projects of different sorts.
Thanks for that question, Nick. I'm happy to answer it if I don't see any of my peers unmute. The research was primarily conducted in public blockchain communities, which I guess are the ones that conceive of themselves as more authentic to the vision and ideology of decentralization. And so by definition, they are open source code. I guess standards are developed in some senses around kind of upgrades to the base layer blockchain protocols there, and then token standards as well. But there's no kind of standard in terms of governance mechanisms. There's a whole lot of different instantiations, but of course, all of the code of each is expected to be open source.
Okay, I was thinking about W3C's initiatives around standardization around identity and the way that portability between different blockchains could be achieved. But that's good. Thanks.
It's a question in the chat from Andam, and who wants to know how care could be introduced. Somebody needs to make sure that they are muting, please. Not sure who that is. Okay. So Anda is asking, how could care be introduced into DAOs?
So I'm happy to handle this question. Our thinking around this is about really ensuring that the constitutions of DAOs are embedded with principles of fairness. We've seen examples in the platform cooperatives and just in the in general worker cooperative, the 10 and 7 principles that really speak to the idea of ensuring that there is fairness, and that it centers the rights of the worker. And so these principles of care that we're sort of, this idea around care is really speaking to this idea of ensuring that exploitative circumstances such as the situation described by Kelsey, where you can have governance token owners and holders assigning their rights to to a worker class. And so if there was a kind of legal framework that DAOs and governance operators within DAOs were legally binded or were legally bound to uphold, then we think that that could be, a potential solution for these, sort of extractive kind of, models where some people within these organizations are being exploited and other people within these organizations are benefiting from that exploitation. So, potentially something like a stewardship kind of, role potentially, where, there is a fiduciary kind of responsibility to, to take care of the, I guess, the needs of those who are, the owners of the tokens, I guess. I'm not sure. Yeah, Kelsey, you might sort of answer that a little better.
No, I completely agree with what you said. I think what's really interesting about blockchain communities and DAOs as a kind of composable module on top of that is it's very ideological and politically ideological, to be specific. And so one thread that's carried very heavily in my research is kind of this question of who or what is being made autonomous in decentralized autonomous organizations. So even at that level, in terms of care, is it about the individual? Is it about the collective? Is it about the ideology, in terms of the immutability of the protocol itself? So it's still very nascent in terms of even these kinds of discussions in DAO communities.
Yeah, so there were a few hands up. I think one I can't see anymore, but now I still see Nick. There was, I think, Alexander Altine had a question before, but maybe we just hear Nick. Alex, if you still have a question, maybe we can hear them together.
Everyone, thanks for that presentation. I just want to ask, in addition to payments, can smart contracts be implemented to regulate and authenticate policy and procedure practice in relation to conflict and mediation within platform co-ops? Post it in the chat. I had to write it down.
I'm happy to respond to that one if that's suitable. Yes, I'm getting nods. In short, yes. So there's really interesting things happening in terms of arbitration. And this is actually a fundamental component of DAOs that was actually highlighted by the legal research group Koala in a research paper called DAO Model Law, in that a DAO must have an internal arbitration mechanism and an external one. And so what DAOs are employing are these things known as decentralized courts. And so they self-govern through these decentralized courts that are predominantly software-based, such as Aragon and Kleros. You can go look those up. And then there's communities that are literally building their own arbitration mechanisms as well. So I've done an ethnographic study on a DAO called One Hive that is kind of aiming to just be decentralized and autonomous as its whole primary objective. And they've built their own sort of arbitration mechanism. So these things exist, they're being tested, they're open source code, they're modular, and they could definitely be experimented with, I guess, by other communities.
Thank you.
Hi, my colleagues. Yeah, I have a question. As far as I know, the DAOs currently are not regulated and not recognized by laws worldwide as a legal entity. So basically, they're acting simply as a community of people creating their own rules in the blockchains using smart contracts and cryptocurrency. Have you thought it's like through the paradigm that the co-op is simply like legal form for the DAOs? Because DAO is currently a technical term more than the legal term.
Okay.
I can keep riffing on DAO questions if you like.
Yeah, we have. I think. Yeah, we have 5 more minutes planned for this discussion. I think there was a carryover question yesterday. We had a DAO session yesterday with Primavera de Filippi and others, and with Sylvie Delacroix as well. And one of the questions that came up there was that in DAOs, often people are not really identified, right? So they're anonymous. So you don't actually know if like one member might be representing an entire collective or just themselves. So how would governance look like if you have facing that problem, for example, right? So maybe wrapping that in, but then we would have to wrap it up to move on to the next group. No pressure, no pressure.
I wanted to make sure that we also answered after that we still have some questions in the chat. So go ahead, Kelsey.
Okay.
Sure. So very briefly, I'll just say we have some peers that are more competent than I in terms of the legal intricacies of DAOs, but they're very much legal entities in some cases. So this is, again, a rapidly developing area. There's a lot of policy action to attract DAOs and kind of capture the market opportunity of these as new forms of institutions. So in Wyoming, you can register a kind of DAO LLC entity. Australia just released a report following a Senate inquiry into fintech and digital assets, which included a recommendation that DAOs be able to be incorporated. And then there's some DAOs that kind of go through sort of legal grays in the sense of, incorporating as a Swiss association when members sign while avoiding KYC. So Trebor, to your kind of provocation there, there's all sorts, and in some situations, such as the big investor DAOs in the US, like Flamingo DAO, it's only accredited investors that can participate and they're KYC'd. And in others, it's open to people that may choose to remain anonymous.
Great. And I see we have a hand raised, but let's answer at least one of the questions in the chat from Jan. Do you have insights around a minimum number of workers part of the DAO to make it an effective technology?
So I love this question. Perhaps my peers can jump in as well, because I feel like I've talked a lot. But we did a fair bit of discussion and research around scale in DAOs. And while there's a lot of vision in blockchain to build scalable social institutions, we see very kind of heterogeneous manifestations of DAOs. So that includes micro scale, where it might be 3 or 4 participants with a very niche kind of hobby interest. But there are actually, and this is where it comes to the DAO to DAO relations, there's kind of these hierarchies in the sense of there's DAOs like such as seed.club that exist to fund and support other DAOs to start. So you can go to a seed club, you can say, I want to start a DAO with my 2 friends around this specific area. And they'll say, yep, just use these very simple tools, keep it as simple as possible. We'll help you know what to do and how to run this digital community and achieve your objectives. And then we'll take a proportion of the tokens that you use to manage incentives in that system as a kind of tithe back to the mother DAO. So that's one interesting example in terms of micro scale and macro scale and overall sort of a network of networks.
And I will add to Kelsey's answers. And we also found in the platform cooperatives, even in micro scale and also macro scale, they have like this governance problem. So, and also the accountability and transparency problem. So I think that we can also like apply it micro DAOs and macro DAOs to those kind of platform cooperatives.
Good. So in the interest of time, I think we should move on to group 2. Yeah.
And maybe the person who raised their hand, Ian, maybe you could put your question in the chat so that this group could answer the second question of Dan and maybe your question too.
Great. Excellent. Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Go ahead. The next group.
Okay. So I'll take this over. So we are another group of 4 people. It's been amazing to work together. Our names are Elettra Bietti, Andrex Beria, Morshed Manan, and Janice Wang. We are partly EU-based, and our project is focused on data cooperatives and small data realities in Europe. And we're looking at legal and other aspects. Please, next slide. I'm not going to go through this. Next slide. Okay, so our main goals are threefold. First, we're interested in mapping the ecosystem of data cooperatives, but also data trusts, data foundations, small data realities that are looking to govern information and data in new ways in Europe. In mapping those small realities, we're interested in surfacing the concerns from a legal and policy perspective that these small realities have in Europe. So what kinds of legal needs they have? Do they have knowledge? Do they lack knowledge? Should they have greater access to certain forms of expertise? And a third goal of ours is to understand how current legislative initiatives in Europe, of course, in Europe, there's GDPR that affects a lot of these efforts, but there are also new legislative proposals like the Data Governance Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and how these new instruments might affect cooperatives and whether cooperatives' voice is being heard at EU level. And our end product is hopefully going to be a white paper to be presented to EU policymakers and cooperatives. And we welcome any forms of input and help from people in this audience. Please, next slide. Okay, so to situate our problem, I'll start by taking a step back and asking, what is data? Because we're talking about data cooperatives, but often we kind of forget the forest behind the trees. And so data is often understood to be, strings of ones and zeros. Some people consider data to be a raw material, like the new oil is the expression that is often used to refer to data. And of course, that's misleading because data is not necessarily a raw material that just sits out there. Other people consider data a commodity, something that is exchanged on marketplaces, a good, a service, something that attracts a form of compensation on a marketplace. Fourthly, data is also often understood as a thing or an object that sits out there that gives rise to entitlements, to rights, to a form of proprietary dominion, for example. And finally, in Europe, especially, but also around the world, data is often understood as an extension of the self. And here we're talking about personal data in particular. So an embodiment of certain characteristics of the person that therefore gives rise to certain special forms of entitlement and control by the individual over those pieces of information out there. And finally, I believe one of the most accurate understandings of data in the current digital economy is understanding data as capital. So understanding data as part of productive processes that lead to profit. Next slide, please. And so what would be helpful in thinking about the direction forward for co-ops and kind of the reality of co-ops in Europe is to think a little bit more about all these different framings of data and try to reframe data as something that is an expression of a context. And so in a capitalist platform economy, data becomes capital. But you could imagine a reality where you have data produced in forms that are not necessarily extractive. Data becomes a result of social relations. Data becomes a result of smaller realities of people using information for pro-social purposes. And so, whereas currently we tend to understand data as something that is inherently part of a capitalist process, that is extracted, that leads to harm, there are other possibilities. And so this frame has three parts to it. The first part is current platform economy data as capital. In the middle, you have a kind of liberal, neoliberal vision of data, which is very much the way that EU law is portraying data as personal data, something that the self should have rights over. And then on the right-hand side, we have kind of the hopeful view of where we should go. And often we see on the ground a lot of cooperatives that are focusing on data as a personal thing and continue to remain stuck in liberal, neoliberal paradigms, partly because GDPR is so stringent on what is possible in relation to data in Europe. But it would be great if we could move towards understanding data as a social good, as a collective resource, as something to be managed in common by people without deferring the management of data to blockchain technologies or other forms of decentralized ecosystems without having the people themselves managing data together. So on this hopeful note, I will pass the mic to Morshad.
Thank you. Could you please change to the next slide? So to build on the sort of theoretical framework that Elettra provided regarding the nature of data and how different legal and policy approaches have conceptualized data, if we look at the GDPR, especially in the EU context, it being so influential, we can home in on some of the particular features and provisions that it has that have been very influential also for data cooperatives. So one is the fact that the GDPR determines parameters and conditions for a data subject to give consent. And we also know, even beyond those who are legal scholars, that it provides a suite of individual rights. And I stress the word individual here, because many of them almost exclusively are individual rights. There could be an argument that some of the rights regarding employees and employees' data rights in collective agreements are more of a collective nature, but primarily these are individual rights for data subjects. And those include, and of particular relevance for us, are rights concerning, for instance, information that is given to a data subject at the time of the collection of data, and rights to data portability. What is really interesting with this trajectory is that while the GDPR was being passed, and in the years since it's been passed, we have seen the emergence of data cooperatives that have tried to operationalize some of the rights that are given individually, so to for instance, help the data subjects to be able to better exercise their individual rights, but also, for instance, to make more informed choices. Now, the GDPR is currently being discussed as being important, but needs to be supplemented with new proposals. And I'll ask to go to the next slide. here, among the new data-related proposals that are emerging to complement the GDPR are the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, but also those that are very relevant, even if they are about a different aspect of the digital economy rather than data protection itself, but they relate to data cooperatives. So something like the Digital Markets Act. I do not have the time to go into all of these at great length, but just to allude to briefly what they cover, the Data Governance Act basically allows individuals to better exercise their individual rights under the GDPR. That's the idea behind it. It is supposed to be supplementary to the GDPR in the sense that the GDPR rights will usually, at least the way it's currently phrased, prevail over rights that are under the Data Governance Act. So it's supposed to, for instance, facilitate data sharing, help improve consent, and so on. It also introduces and defines data cooperatives, which I will get to in a little while. Alongside that, we also see something like the Digital Markets Act, which identifies large platform companies that can be classified as gatekeepers and provides obligations for these larger gatekeeper platforms. So for instance, to allow portability of the data that is produced by end users, as well as tools to be able to do this. It also has particular provisions targeted at business users, including small business users, with access to data that is generated in the context of their own providing of data, as well as their interaction with their own end users. And we can imagine how this can also be of relevance for not just data cooperatives, but perhaps platform cooperatives that are in interaction with large gatekeeper platforms. And finally, it provides for potential structural remedies as far as including the breaking up of gatekeepers' business. So all of these are very important proposals that we believe are of relevance for data cooperatives. And finally, there's also this proposed idea of a data act, which would create a legal framework for business to business and business to government data sharing that could also be of interest for platform cooperatives. If you could go to the next slide. So I just want to pick on one of those examples before handing it over to why we decided to look at laws and policies. We wanted to look at, for instance, a proposal like the Data Governance Act, because we see that there is existing legislation that the data cooperatives have already been responding to, have even built their business models around. But there are also a suite of new laws and policies being proposed that may have a bearing in both enabling the data cooperatives to prosper, but could also have unforeseen effects. So the Data Governance Act, for instance, explicitly recognized there to be a role for data cooperatives. It gives allows the end user to make informed choices about how they consent to data use, especially before collection happens. It enables negotiating with third parties, which is also really important because a lot of the fact that processing happens in a way that the issue of how informed it is still open to question. And then there's the explicit regulation of data cooperatives for the first time in this proposal as well. So for instance, it creates a notification procedure for those who are doing data sharing services like data co-ops that they have to abide by before they begin operations. It will also introduce a new set of mandatory conditions, such as prohibiting the secondary use of metadata, which is something any data cooperative that operates as such will have to take into account. And lastly, and very importantly, it introduces this concept of data altruism, which is when personal and non-personal data is used for the public interest. So we could imagine that all data cooperatives could fall under this heading, but that isn't necessarily the case. The proposal also provides rules about being non-profit, being in the public interest, and so on, which some cooperatives might fall under and others might not. And so there's also a procedure for being recognized as a data altruism organization. And so as a team, we were really interested in seeing how could our cooperative ecosystem that we're seeing, especially the data cooperatives, be perceiving these proposed laws and policies. So with that, I'll hand it over.
Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to explain briefly which is the methodology that we followed in order to conduct our research. So first of all, we chose the topic, which in this sense like was explained by Elettra, saying that it was the relation that the data cops have with the current legislation, but also with the proposals that are being proposed. No? Later on, we did a small research on these different proposals or legal framework, GDPR, DGA, and DMA, to understand it better. And we prepared some questions in order to understand better how these data cops work, and also how do they relate to this legal framework. No? We did interviews to different data cops, such as Saluscop, Polypoly, SAOS, Diorg, and also Driver Seat, so most of them in Europe, but we also wanted to check how were they doing on different parts of the world, such as the United States, and then we did analysis and a presentation like we are doing now, okay? Next slide. Okay, so the questions, we conducted them in three main fields. First of all, we try to understand how these cooperatives or organizations work, and this means how do they handle the data, for example, the organization structure, how are they scaling to different countries, and under which reasons, no? And the challenges that they are having setting up the cooperative itself, or also their applications, no? Another field that we were asking about, it was definitely the legal issues. So first of all, we wanted to know how do they feel with the current legislative frame, let's say with the GDPR, but also whether they know and whether they have any information on the Data Governance Act and the Digital Market Act, no, that are coming, or which was their perception about them. Also, we wanted to know how this law affect them and what changes will they propose to them, no? And last but not least, we also wanted to understand which is the relation of these data cops with the public institutions and whether they have a tight relation, whether they cooperate or not, no? Next slide, please. So, one of the sentences that shocked us in a way, or we found super interesting, and it came from different data cops, was that we don't want to have responsibility over the data, no? It's something that somehow we didn't expect as a team, but from Polypoly and also Francesca, you can see there from Saluscop, we got this answer, and I think it was very interesting, no? Because we thought that somehow the data cops wanted to have control also over the data in order to give it to the citizens, no? But what we found out is that for different reasons, ideological and legal ones, they didn't want to handle the data. Next slide, please. And some of the other important takeaways that we had is, first of all, that the general perception of the new proposals are not affecting individuals or data cops. So Data Governance Act and the Digital Market Act are not perceived to affect them directly, and they always say that it's for big players, so somehow not affecting to data cops. Also, we realized that the main challenges of these data cops currently are not legal, but more raising the awareness of the citizens and helping themselves to use their applications. We found different attitudes towards legal infrastructure. So we found that some cops have built their business model around the GDPR, and this was very interesting because from what we heard is they said that it was the first time that the law goes first and the technology follows. No, so the GDPR was created, and these data cops have built their business models around this GDPR. So it was very interesting, and actually they feel very, very connected to this regulation. And then we also perceived that there were difficulties to build, for example, a European data cooperative. No, regarding the data management, we found two different approaches. No, one was the individual one, so data is saved on users' devices. But then there was another one that it was more focused on improving the business areas, which was aimed to pulling the data from the users. No. And last, the relationship with public institution varies between data cops, but in general, there is a good relationship with public institution and there is contact, but they were lacking a proactive attitude from public institutions. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Ander. I'm wary of time, so I'm going to sum up very quickly to make sure that we have time for questions and also the break following as well. So some of our initial findings in terms of, how do we actually understand data cooperatives from our research, both legal and empirical, is that one, we need to understand to what extent cooperatives actually collect and store data. I'm following on from what Ander has just said. We need to understand what the business model and the industry in which the data cooperative sits or aims to sit, because it really shapes the relationship that they have in terms of data and how the cooperative is set up in the first place. And finally, one really important part of the equation is understanding the purpose of the data cooperative, because for some cooperatives, the main objective is control or agency over data, while for others, it's about greater social values as well. So what are our next steps? So in terms of, if we move on to the next slide, we can see that importantly, part of our work is bridging the gap between understanding cooperatives, their understanding of data, laws and policies, and what misalignments there may be. But importantly, for those in the audience who are data cooperatives or want to have a say in this area, we are continuing to conduct some of these interviews. So please get in touch with us either through Zoom or we have our emails at the last slide as well. And finally, if we move on to the next slide to just conclude, bringing everyone's insights together, we believe that data cooperatives present an alternative and radical model for data governance, particularly where data cooperatives can actually be lawmakers and really new legal proposals within the EU, but also cross borders, as well as public institutions, should be more proactive in terms of getting feedback from data cooperatives, getting them involved in the process of creating these proposals so that we can actually support new models for the digital economy that we're in. And we're really keen on facilitating conversations with different scholars and practitioners across legal, social, technical, and economic spheres as well. So I'm going to end there, and just a final slide just to thank you very much for listening, and we really hope to continue this conversation.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for these fantastic presentations. And so let's just jump right in. There were lots of questions, I think, in the chat already. Maybe we can start with one of those. So Nick Main asked, can you comment about the tension between different approaches, personal data as a property right versus handling of personal data as agency, human rights? Do you see a data co-op as a commons of data held in common as a property right?
Morsha, do you want to, or should I? I'm happy to.
Yeah, maybe if you could go ahead. Yeah.
I'm happy to offer some thoughts. So I think, especially in Europe, okay, so now let's kind of situate ourselves in Europe, because I'm also kind of in the US, so I follow both ways of talking about data. But I think in Europe in particular, there are sharp distinctions made between thinking about data as a property, something to be owned, and thinking of data as a human right. And I think very often that relies on certain assumptions about what property is and about what a human right is that kind of could fall apart in theory. So I don't necessarily think that those distinctions are tenable when you start scrutinizing them. And I think in particular that property as kind of understood in a liberal legal system is about the ability to exclude. And so that's why it's considered the paradigm of a capitalist economy. But in fact, you can construe property rights in much more capacious ways and think about property in a Hofeldian way as a set of relations over a resource. And if you start construing property as relations over resources, you can move towards common types of ownership. You can think of data as a commons, you can think of data as a resource that many people can have entitlements over at the same time. You can think of data as something that doesn't need to be excluded necessarily, but that just needs to be managed in certain specific types of ways. And that becomes very close to the idea of data as something that needs to be co-determined for the social good, and that needs to be self-determined by a group of people. And so in certain ways, it goes back to the idea of data as a human right, and as the kind of German right to informational self-determination that is a ground for considering data part of data protection and part of kind of the protection of a human right. But I think the difference there is that data protection is kind of focused on the protection of data as a personal human right, as an individual human right. Whereas I think if you start thinking about property in this kind of more capacious way, you can reach understandings of data as a collective resource that I think are more fruitful potentially. But of course, the two also can live together.
If I can just add a little bit to what Electra just said, with the respect to the Data Governance Act, they explicitly mention in the sort of like the statements that were made before it was first published as the proposal, was that they want to create a data commons in Europe, and so they actually use and allude to the commons language. And they appeal to the idea of a commons. Now, what some have already responded to, and as I mentioned, these are proposals rather than legislation that has been promulgated. So those who have responded to it, some of them have already commented that this could lead to concerns about how this commons language is abused. So one particular group that responded to the proposal said that because of how personal data might be shared, and like being very careful about the language that is used and how this is conceived in this proposal document, there could be concerns about this not really being just a commons, but being a way of just like a private entity being able to really have a coercive influence over those who are its members. So there were concerns being raised about this, that just by calling it a commons doesn't necessarily make it into a commons. And so a lot of it, of course, is about how this is governed and set up. And so we come back to a lot of the long-standing questions about it being a commons management, and actually making sure that the cooperative follows through in in actually living, walking the walk rather than just talking the talk.
And Alfred Whitman has two questions. First, he asks if a platform co-op is considered a data co-op because a platform has data and that data is owned and governed by its members. So more like a definitional question. I could even speak to that too. And then the second question is, to what extent do these findings apply to the UK?
Yeah, I can jump in on those two questions. And I think actually Alfred's first question also overlaps a little bit with the commons question that Nick had as well. I think one of the challenges in this area is that when it comes to thinking about data stewardship and data governance, it's become a hot topic more recently, particularly with the pandemic and the importance of communities actually thinking about, well, we don't want data, whether personal or non-personal, aggregated, and so forth, to be in the hands of very few very large companies, wherever you're situated. And so there are challenges in whether, for example, in actually defining platform cooperatives and data cooperatives. This was actually something that came out in our interviews as well, which is why we featured it in our axes for understanding co-ops. Is actually, there are different degrees in which cooperatives consider themselves to be co-ops, because some are registered formally, some consider themselves as not just nonprofits, but act in a way that follows cooperative movements. But the focus really, I think, is about members, and this is something that we've talked about quite a lot in the context of the research sprint as a whole, across our participants, and actually how do we make sure that the aims and objectives of cooperatives as a whole, and then applied to data, actually still follow traditional cooperative principles in that sense. And so it really depends on how the cooperatives see themselves. And so that's why we're quite careful trying not to generalize data and platform cooperatives as a whole. And then to the second question about the UK, I think yes. You know, I mean, thinking about the GDPR, you know, the UK is considering moving away from and creating their own data protection regulations, but that doesn't mean that when it comes to thinking about the Data Governance Act or the Data Act more generally, that some of these rules won't apply to the UK, particularly when data transfers are still happening. But it's just it's a space to keep an eye on, and it's not clear how these proposals or regulations will necessarily apply. But I'm sure they will, and there will be conversations about to what extent the UK will follow suit.
So Sven had a few questions, but is there more? Let me see.
I could just add just the fact that I think organizing a cooperative around the management of data is not necessarily all there is to it. So there are cooperatives, for example, in the US that are organized around labor and that also have data as a part of their activity, like the drivers co-op. And personally, I think that those are actually the better ways of thinking about it rather than thinking about a co-op as a way of managing data, because I think we're kind of falling very easily in the fallacy that data is a thing that kind of sits out there and that is more important than other things. Whereas actually what's important is to build relations that are pro-social, so that whatever comes out of it is data that is pro-social.
So Sven had some questions as well about how this can be implemented and if he has to lobby for it. But I think that may have been already answered in the chat. Don't know if there are other questions.
Maybe just to add to that question of lobbying, no? I think it was interesting what we were getting as a comment from Salus COP, no? That they were saying that when they ask for from the health data of an individual, it lasts 2 years, no, to get it, and they got like a bunch of papers. So what they were saying is when they come to public institutions in order to talk about their proposal, public institutions were looking like really with good eyes their proposal. But actually, for me, it was interesting that the reality is this, that from what they were saying is public institutions were a bit afraid of the big change that this could bring, no? So that make them not to have such a proactive attitude. So for me, therefore, there is a need of a lot of pedagogy, not only raising the awareness on citizens, but also on public institutions, no? So that this can be promoted.
I'll also say regarding the lobbying, I think it's one of the things that we're really interested in doing is trying to understand the extent to which there's a gap in kind of the policy space and the extent to which, of course, you know, big tech companies have their voice heard routinely by EU legislators. And on the other hand, many of the cooperatives that we talk to don't even have legal expertise within the co-op and often don't even, well, a lot of the people within the co-op don't know much about the legal issues. But if there is one person, they might not even be a lawyer and maybe they're in contact with some other person. And it just sounds very detached from the reality of the way that law is actually evolving. And sometimes it feels like there's a mismatch between the legislations that we're seeing and the reality of trying to build these new possibilities on the ground. And so we think that there is a case to be made for greater dialogue between policymakers and small cooperatives, and maybe there needs to be some sort of intermediary that can speak to policymakers on behalf of cooperatives. And if anyone in this room has some insights or wants to talk about that, we would be very, very interested in talking to you.
If I can just add like one sentence and like a really particular point that I think is really important here, you'll notice that there is, if you look at the Data Governance Act, that there is a very particular conception of what a data cooperative is. And there might be people in this room who disagree with this particular conceptualization of what a data cooperative is. And I think, especially as it's going through this, legislative process, it would be, I think, really important for us to be able to try to at least, raise concerns about this. And I think just in what we've been doing so far in our research and the people we've been speaking to, this mismatch is already starting to come to the fore a bit.
It's such an important point, Moshe, and also something that came up at the conference, right? So that there's so much co-op washing going on in this space where this term cooperative is used with a lot of ease, but really not referring to cooperative principles at all. And something that we saw so clearly for those of us who followed the so-called sharing economy and the emergence thereof, and their use of the language and discourse of counterculture, right, and of cooperatives to sell commercial platforms, essentially, right? So this discourse of love and this discourse of counterculture and of sharing and of cooperation, has been abused before. So we should be very careful and, as Moshe said, really point that out. Good. Should we dive into more questions? Can't see if there are more here in the chat.
It's actually time for a break, Trebor.
And so let's take a break then. Yeah, that's great. Excellent.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So we have a break. So the break is going to be 5 minutes. So it will be from 1:16 p.m. to 1:21. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Thank you, second group, for your presentation.
Great. So welcome back to the third working group. Should we certify data cooperatives? Really fascinating question and fantastic group. I will let them introduce themselves, but you see their names here. Just to contextualize, this is really a discussion that is really close to a lot of people, I think, in this movement that ask themselves this question, if certification makes sense. And it's a really rich discussion with lots of arguments on both sides. So I hand it over to the last group here. Who wants to take the lead?
I'll do. Hi, everyone. Hope you hear me well. I'm outside at the Cooperative University in Valencia. And I am Ana Aguirre. And if you take us to the next slide, I'll start showing you who we are and why do we think this is something. As you all know, that we're 4 people, and out today with you, it's me, Ana, and Sadef. And I'll not be reading through all of the definitions, so you can find us later for our bios. So if you want to take us to the next step. Our group first started thinking on why develop a certification for platform cooperatives, and because we assumed that it would be interesting to do it, and we assume what the assumptions were for that was that if we had technical standards, we'll make it easier to start a data cooperative because we would know more of what it is and have more structured idea of what it is, that it would benefit from consistent standards and nomenclature, so we could own the narrative, and that will give a sense that the entities are calling themselves co-ops when they aren't could be erased, because there will be some sort of certification that will not allow for that to happen. Because, one of the issues that we raised was the need to preserve the spirit of worker cooperatives as platform co-ops. Those were assumptions we started with on why, right? But then if you take it to the next slide, also concerns were raised on what happens when we create a certification and who gets to define that certification, or if we decide that one entity should do it, is this too much of a top-down approach? Who is it, and how is this something that it's collectively owned or not? And then we thought that maybe this could be a challenge for smaller cooperatives, right? Because big cooperatives, maybe they have the time and the resources to invest in getting certified. But what happens to those who can afford a certification because they are smaller co-ops? And I say can't afford, maybe by money or financial resources, but I know at the time that you need to put into getting certified when you are just willing to survive at somehow, right? So that raised a concern. Are only big co-ops going to be certified because the rest can't afford to invest resources on this? And then we realized that if you are to certify someone, at some point someone needs to audit whether that certification is being adjusted, like the activity of that co-op is adjusting to what the certification really means. And will this workload be too huge? Who will take it over? So those were concerns that were raised. Next. Then we also had the potential incentives of, well, you would access a network of platform co-ops that are certified, so therefore you know their activity is a platform co-op. You would maybe be able to have technical support for this, and it would be a possible symbol of prestige and legitimacy, right? If you are certified, you could say, well, I am really a platform co-op. So those will give you that prestige. Next. And these all came from the understanding and the debates that we had internally, and especially me coming from the worker co-op world and the ICA youth and everything. We said, well, this topic and this narrative, it may be very natural for a lot of people, but for existing co-ops or cooperative entrepreneurs, this may be very hard to understand what platform cooperatives really are. So how can we make it really easy for these people to know what a platform co-op is, and making the data and platform talk more mainstream and less alienating for the existing cooperative sector, maybe a highlight of why we want to pursue this understanding of whether certifying or maybe just creating a common language would be interesting, right? And understanding whether certification could help existing or newly created cooperative business look at platforms and data without fear, because this is something that me especially you know, I live like this every day when I come to the course, and I'm like, okay, how is this a normal human in the cooperative world would actually look at platform co-ops and at data with a sense of opportunity? And now Sadaf is going to take over and explain the research that we did.
Thank you so
Next
much, Anna.
Slide.
Thank you. So I'm going to get started. We split our sprint into 3 stages. The first stage was kind of a set of surveys. The second stage is a landscape overview of the platform cooperative and data cooperative space. And then the third is kind of solutions, like where do we go with this project? And that's where we're kind of hoping to solicit some feedback from the audience at the end. So the surveys were aimed at answering the question, how do platform cooperatives, including data cooperatives, currently use or hope to use data? You know, as Trebor said earlier in this presentation, a cooperative with a website isn't necessarily a platform cooperative. So we felt that beginning to answer whether to certify data cooperatives, we first needed to understand commonalities in how existing cooperatives were actually approaching data, as these might form the foundation of any certification that we might see. So we sent our surveys to a list of what we defined as platform or thought were platform cooperatives, including names like Politics Rewired, The Good Data, Tech Collective, Taxi App. Our first survey asked very detailed questions about how cooperatives approach data. And our second data asked kind of 2 very brief questions that were much more introductory. These questions included things like, how do you currently use data? Do you feel like you are using data to its full potential? What can be learned from data using cooperatives to support cooperatives that don't currently use data? We acknowledge that the survey had some limitations, including a low response rate and differential understandings among respondents of the questions. So we therefore supplemented the surveys with some qualitative interviews with 2 co-ops. One was called Spoke and the other was called True.co. Next slide, please. So, you know, as mentioned earlier, this next stage is to develop, which we haven't gotten to yet, is to develop a kind of landscape overview of cooperatives that are using data to inform a set of kind of working definitions. We see this initiative as essential to the discourse shaping that's going on. You know, given the nascency of this space, we see that, you know, this kind of effort can play a role in shaping the discourse, given the amount of cooperative washing that's going on and the indeterminacy around the concept of data cooperatives. And we feel like the definitions that derive from this landscape can be used to inform certification, or maybe a set of recommendations for cooperatives aspiring to use data, or even promoting a set of, you know, technical standards around data use. So next question, please. So first, I'd like to share some findings from our surveys. Again, we don't have a sufficiently large sample to make definitive statements. So the following are kind of general impressions from our in-progress results, which we think will be helpful in shaping further questions. The current samples include 10 responses to the more detailed survey 1 and 13 responses to survey 2. Next slide, please. So as you can see, our first takeaway was that there was incredible diversity, even among the small number of respondents to both surveys. This diversity was in terms of how data was being used, privacy protections being employed, and ownership models. So in terms of how data is being used, you know, we saw one data co-op called Disco, which calls their approach a community algorithmic trust, which is basically describing the software that they're building that embodies cooperative principles. Another has assigned something called a data officer and has agreements in place with their clients. In terms of privacy, we see that some follow kind of industry standards imposed on them because they're working as software as a service providers. Others simply use Excel sheets. And in terms of ownership and organizational models, we also saw a lot of variation. Some called themselves sociocracies, others have kind of varying forms of flatness and organizational hierarchy. So altogether, we see this diversity as reflective of kind of the wide variety of perhaps domains in which cooperatives that use data actually operate. We see a lot of experimentation, and perhaps we even see the reflection of, you know, varying underlying legal structures, given that all of these are not US based. And that's kind of been discussed in the previous presentation group for us. So next slide, please. Next, we see that among these cooperatives, key questions primarily encompass the collection of data and the monetization of data. So questions surrounding collection range from themes like I don't know what data I should collect. There were 5 responses for that. To I don't know what legal structures surround data collection. 4 respondents to that. Then there were questions around monetization. 6 respondents said, I don't know how to monetize data. Next slide, please. So kind of digging further into the question of monetization, here again, there's only 6 respondents, but none of the respondents currently monetize their data, which could indicate that perhaps, co-ops just don't know how to monetize their data. The other half, do not plan to or don't see any value in it. So, this heterogeneity could reflect, different value judgments that cooperatives might make around the question of monetization. Which might suggest that any attempt at certification would want to consider these differences. And we don't want to stifle kind of alternative futures where data need not necessarily take on the logic of capitalism. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Here you can see that some data cooperatives vary in their use of technical standards governing their data. As you can see, many of them use a form of encryption, but some also use data portability mechanisms or experimenting with blockchain protocols or something called an API webhook. Again, these could simply reflect underlying differences in the legal regimes in which these cooperatives operate, a desire for experimentation with things like blockchain or DAOs like the first group mentioned, or kind of features of just the sectors in which they operate. So next slide, please. So finally, what we really saw is innovation. As cooperatives develop new approaches to data, and they develop new approaches to data as they work through the practical problems kind of related to their own missions. We see interest in experimentation in forms like data trusts, community algorithmic trust, as we mentioned earlier with Disco, kind of in the software as a service space. We have one cooperative that purely is like a tech company building software as a service. They're experimenting with kind of financial restitution for their workers. And then finally, we seek innovation in terms of legal frameworks, especially when it comes to a data cooperative sharing data with external parties. We learned that from one of our interviews with True.co. So we felt that this innovation could actually be the result of the lack of existing certifications and standards. But again, it also means that a lot of cooperatives are kind of forced to reinvent the wheel, which they may not have to if there were kind of standards out there that could, or standard forms out there that they could simply, copy. This dichotomy was really captured by one of our interviewees from Spoke, who said, we don't know what the options are other than making it up as we go along, which is what most cooperatives have to do. So the trade-off seems to be that the lack of certification might promote innovation, but perhaps something like technical or legal standard forms could make life easier for cooperatives, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Next slide, please. And this leaves us at our final stage, which is, we're at an open question, and this is what we'd love to kind of get feedback from the audience on. Given diversity and innovation in the field, could certifications be stifling? We see a desire among cooperatives to make more use of data, but they don't currently know how to. Could there be room for technical and standard legal forms to provide new and growing cooperatives with a blueprint for cooperative data use? On the technical side, this may look like, encryption standards, privacy protections, cybersecurity standards. On the legal side, this might look like standard business agreement forms that allow a data cooperative to shut off access to user data for violations of contractual agreements, when they share that data with businesses or researchers. Finally, I was reminded of a quote from the famous architect and designer, Charles Eames, who said that design depends largely on constraints. In a sense, structure enables creativity often. So therefore, could standards or even certifications promote innovation by providing cooperatives with a stable base around which to develop new forms? And then finally, this is something that we saw in the comments over today's presentations, which was, are there other movements that we might look to for inspiration outside the cooperative movement? We'd love to get feedback on that. So next slide, please. We learned an immense amount from our own internal discussions, given the variations in our group in terms of technical backgrounds. Anna leads a worker co-op, so really had some fruitful and rich discussion. We're hoping to turn that into a white paper, which will hopefully inform this ongoing discussion around certification. And we would love to thank kind of the following individuals for all of their helpful feedback in developing this presentation. Professor Trebor Scholz, Dr. Sylvan, Adam Nagy, Valerie Gomez, Professor Nathan Schneider, the other participants in our sprint, and then the two co-ops that we spoke to, True.co and Spoke. Thank you very much. Oh, also Anna has shared a link in the chat to the surveys that we sent out. And we'd love for anyone who might have the time to answer those to take a shot at it.
Good. I'm very, very curious about responses to this great presentation. Standard certifications, are those the same things, right? I wonder, like, what questions do people have? Is this, does certification make sense, right? Like all of these questions that came up, I mean, there's so much to say really on such a rich discussion with lots of arguments in favor, right? And really lots of things to say cautiously about it as well. So let's hear some of those voices. So you can either write it in the chat if you feel more comfortable, or you can also just raise your hand here in Zoom and we will call on you.
There is a question. The first question was by Artem. I don't know if he wants to close it out, or should I read it out of the chat?
Yeah,
Artem?
just read it. Yeah, great.
Artem?
Okay.
I'll just read it out. Do you think it's possible and or would make sense to create some kind of scoring system for co-ops in addition to the certification? I think it will create powerful incentives. For instance, if there were a ranking of governance design based on the same criteria in a particular industry or region, it would also facilitate knowledge transfer. New co-ops will know who to learn from. Personally, and I will speak for myself, and then Sadaf can contribute too if he thinks. Personally, I think it's a tricky space, right? Because again, we're looking at the possibility of who creates the criteria in the first place to certify or to actually rank the cooperatives, who ranked the cooperatives, and who audits whether those cooperatives are actually being truthful about what they're saying. And then it also contributes to me as coming from a very small co-op, and I think you as well, how many of the co-ops that may be having a super governance structure and a very good work feeling have the capacity to actually pursue these kind of things, unless there is a very clear outcome and value coming from being certified or ranked, right? So I think that there is a trickiness of that are the same constraints that we talked about, right? It's on the one hand, who values this and who designs the criteria, and then who has the time and resources to apply and to actually follow up with the criteria of, on the one hand, being certified, on the second hand, to actually be ranked. Because my fear as a small co-op always is, do we create spaces where the biggest co-ops have the most to actually win from, and then we're actually creating a bigger of a gap for smaller co-ops that can have the time, and I'm not talking only investment in terms of money, but actually the time to pursue those kind of things, because they are trying to just pay salaries at the end of the month for their members, or for their workers in my case, right? So for me, this is a trickiness. I think it will be interesting, but on the other hand, it always, as a practical person, it always comes to me like, okay, how valuable is this for people that would be losing or wasting time of the practicality to actually pursue these kind of things? So I don't know if you have.
No, I think that was a beautiful answer, Anna, and I think it's just reflective of like how important it is to have the perspective of folks who actually work in, work at cooperatives answering these questions. So I think the only thing I would add on to that is that, there may be room in the sense of the technical nature, in which that's where kind of my thinking has been on this project, like because managing data does involve some kind of technical processes. And perhaps if you're looking at privacy protections around data, there could be a way of, scoring that or creating a set of standards. In the US, we have something similar for the cybersecurity space, where we've developed a set of standards developed in industry where it's kind of a gold badge if someone meets those kind of encryption and cybersecurity standards. Do I think that makes sense in the data cooperative space to kind of create a score for privacy or cybersecurity right now? No, I think it's a little too nascent, and I think it might create kind of unnecessary barriers to entry that kind of emerging co-ops may not be able to afford to take on. But I think in the longer term, scoring those kinds of technical, measures could make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult. Right?
Now, on the other hand, I think that to actually have a good examples of good practices is something that would actually inspire already existing co-ops and co-op entrepreneurs to create new co-ops. And I think this is some conversation that we've had in Berlin the past week, is how do we make sure that we, highlight and visualize models that are working, that are positive, that are impacting positively in the community, and that are actually replicable and scalable for, co-op entrepreneurs to take over on or actually be inspired by. So on the other hand, I do agree with you, Artem, that it may be a possibility to actually visualize the not always visualized models, because somehow bigger co-ops get more visibility. So how can we put attention towards models that may be excellent, that are smaller, and in a way could be scalable by people that take on those. So for instance, the best practice part, I think it would be very interesting to approach.
Absolutely, right. Case studies and storytelling, I think, is important too, and really finding sort of this Wikipedia of the space, right? That's I think what we are sort of working towards.
And then there is a second one that Marcelo Palladino. Marcelo Palladino Castro, I'm sure that this is not a regular.
Right.
Marcelo asked, as cooperatives, who data covers the business with, and under what rules capitalist or solidarity are based? So that if you wanted to go into it, but this is not something that we can, I don't think this is something that we've put highlight on during our research, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think there's immense variation in who data co-ops do business with. I can draw upon the interview we did with a data co-op called True.co, which is operating in the kind of social media space. They're trying to build a social media data trust where the users would kind of belong to this data cooperative, and then that data could then be shared with kind of organizations that reflect the values of the data cooperative. And there would be kind of legal agreements in place where if the partner that they share that data with, whether it's a researcher or another business, kind of violates the terms of the agreement, they have not only legal mechanisms for shutting off access to the data of that cooperative, but also kind of technical mechanisms where there's permission layers built into kind of each component of data that is shared. So that's an example of a data cooperative that operates in collecting social media type data, sharing data with researchers or other businesses. And I think in terms of whether they would follow capitalist or solidarity sharing based rules, I think part of that question is the values and rules that are determined by the data cooperative itself for how its data should be used. But part of it is also kind of taking on the logic of the legal system or the society within which these cooperatives and their partners are operating in. So, yeah.
And then to add to that, and this is a personal opinion on my side, so do not blame my team research if you don't agree. This is a personal opinion of mine. I think that one of the beautiful things about the co-op movement as a whole is that it can't, or I don't think it should be isolated from the mainstream movement of the business world, right? It can show example of how we can do business better, but I don't think it is smart from our side to actually be totally isolated and create a parallel system of economy and social impact. So I would say that put the values in the middle and realize which kind of those values actually match with what you're doing. And then how can you be integrated in the existing system of economic and social value? Because I don't think that we can pretend to be a movement that is totally isolated from the capitalist business, because if not, a lot of the co-ops are going to just die because they are not going to be able to reach enough business to survive. And this is something that we've had struggles with in my co-op as well. And I think that coming from a very big co-op environment like the Mondragon area, I think one of the things that I was sharing also with Sadaf yesterday is the Mondragon co-ops not necessarily put a highlight on the we're co-ops part, because it just comes naturally on the way they do business, and they just call themselves business. And this happened to me also in the past. So it's like, how much value do we give to what we do and how we do it, and how are we able to keep our values and keep the philosophy on which we are created and actually navigate the capital structure will be my main challenge. And answering to what Ian asked about, may this be a role and relationship for a platform co-op apex body which provides forum and specialist legal advice to members? I'm actually pretty sure they could be, right? This is, I mean, maybe Trebor wants to share more, but I think that this is something that is being considered over the last couple of months, I was going to say, but also in Berlin, and also how it is integrated inside the ICA's bodies. And I am part of the group that is actually trying to redesign the cooperative identity before the Congress. So all of this, I think, is something that it's in the midst of being made, and actually, for sure, a space where on the ICA and the cooperative movement that actually works very substantially in these kind of matters, I think is the only way to make it more mainstream for the co-op movement, which I think is exactly what we need to not lose those people that may be the most convinced. And as part of the ICA Youth Committee, we're putting it in the youth agenda for the years to come. So yeah, I don't know if Trebor wants to share more, but I totally agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I was trying to learn from B Corps, right? And as part of our work together, I shared like this chapter on B cooperatives, right? And in a way, how, like some companies have used that certification to sort of as a cosmetic change, right? Like to appear as sort of do-gooders, right, in the world, and perhaps not always, there wasn't always so much substance behind that. So I think that's a danger, right? Like I also can see that there's this question that in many countries, platform co-ops like legally cannot actually be cooperatives, which means like we have to be open to co-op adjacent groups, right? So like certification couldn't really focus on legal incorporation, because then you exclude just people because they are whatever, live in Brazil or Japan, they suddenly can't be part of this. Personally, I'm not sure if at this point, as Sadaf said, maybe it's really too early to even have that discussion. And also, I would probably rather focus efforts to build like incubators and actually help this Apex organization to really coordinate the efforts globally that are done to actually build it, right, before we start to certify it. So maybe to really figure out the business models that work in particular sectors like care, or I don't know, like data cooperatives, right, or transportation, like to really have these sort of business canvases that actually are proven to work, right? To really focus on that and to have the research and really strong case studies of successful platform co-ops that makes hundreds of millions of euros, as we have a handful already, but certainly not enough, right? So really hoping for Harvard Business School case study here on one of those platform cooperatives. And we are working on that for quite some time. So if you can support that agenda, that would be fantastic, because that would be, I think, a great next step as well. Marsha, do you want to chime in as well? You put a comment here.
I mean, I think my comment, I spent some time writing it, so it's basically all there. But it was just the idea that I get the impression that a lot of our discussion on data and how it's used and collected, of course, focuses on recent developments. But I think taking a longer view of the 175-year history and more that Trebor alluded to at the beginning allows us to think that maybe data has been collected and used and thought about in the past as well, in the sort of the pre-digital eras as well. And I think like one that sort of immediately comes to mind is thinking of how both colonial and post-colonial administrations were using cooperatives as a decentralized sort of quote unquote, it was in a way very centralized, but in the sense of it being spread throughout the country, a way of collecting data in data scarce environments. So to put a concrete example, if you're worried that there are usurious money lenders exploiting peasants because of the fact that they are charging 1,500% interest, creating accredited and savings loans cooperative is a way of both creating self-reliance in terms of how the credit is dispersed in that community, but it's also a first step in starting to collect data about debt defaults, about who is borrowing how much, and so on and so forth. And that eventually evolved into other uses as well beyond the sort of like small scale finance. If, for instance, in multi-purpose cooperatives, part of the purpose of a cooperative was to create employment, but was also to promote birth control. And I shared an article about this. And this was also a way of gathering data about birth control rates and our contraception usage, and so on and so forth. So I think it would be really interesting, perhaps as a way of connecting this discussion to an older discussion in a way of seeing how data use has evolved over time by cooperatives. So that was basically just something I thought that complements a lot of what was said in this great presentation by the last team.
Right, so thank you, Anna, and thank you, Sadaf. So we have 7 minutes left, which would allow us to ask some general questions or comments from everybody, maybe also going back to the other two groups. This would be a good moment to do that. There are still 2 more sessions today. So there's a session on this vision of a cooperative commonwealth, right? So this big vision behind all of this work, a question that often comes up also with when you start an Apex or when you want to certify, that question certainly matters. So that's one session today. And then we are closing with a session by McKenzie Wark today, who many of you may be familiar with. I don't know if Adam had more questions or any other of you. I don't want to leave anyone out here. Adam, did you have more questions?
Thanks, Trebor. I feel as though a lot of the things I wanted to bring up were covered or were otherwise, we've kind of moved past. I did want to thank everyone, and I also wanted to maybe spend some time pointing everyone to what the final outcomes of this research sprint will be. So in the following weeks, please be on the lookout for resources from the Berkman Klein Center, where we're sort of hoping to consolidate a lot of the work that these groups have been presenting in one place. And similarly, these will be available on Trebor's platform as well. And also several of these groups were doing qualitative research and surveys. So if you are a member of a co-op that might be able to contribute to those efforts, please do, and please share those within your networks. Oh, and then in terms, one thing I'd also like to mention is we've had, as Liz mentioned at the top, this is week 7 or 8 of a 10-week program. And over the course of these weeks, we've had many great speakers who have given presentations to this cohort, and we do aim to make those presentations available to the public in the near future. And please also be on the lookout for that as well.
And of course, Ludovica had asked, and others might want to know too. So of course, the entire conference, so all day, this is one session of 6 days of conferencing, right? So there have been many, many sessions, all of which will be available in the next few days. So we will make all of them available, and also hopefully even the presentations of the speakers for the other conference sessions at least will also be available. So we will make all of that accessible to you in the next few days.
It looks like we have a hand raised.
Nick, yeah.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just a quick question. It's about certification. Just wondering if, in considering certification, we didn't just consider the cooperative as a whole, or platform cooperative as a whole, but rather what a platform cooperative might need in general terms to do its business, what certifications it needs for itself. For example, cooperatives concerned with teaching or learning, you might have a common need to have a certification of competence or or trust. So there are many forms of certification like this. And I just wonder whether it would be useful, or in the studies, if that came up as an issue.
Yeah, so we have a lot of talks about certification and how is this something that it can be general for all co-ops, or it needs to be field specific, or as you said, a combination of whether it needs to be what a platform co-op really is, and then which field does it operate on, and then which needs does each field need to go into. And this is why at the beginning we were just thinking of, okay, how do we certify? And then the question became, should we certify, or who should certify, or does it make sense to certify? Or so it went from a very believer role of like, yes, let's certificate, and towards a much more complex conversation of whether this is something that is valuable for who is becoming or potentially could be certified. And you're right, our thoughts went to that field as well. It's like, okay, as a worker owner and as a worker owned co-op, do I certify myself like for the way and a platform co-op that is worker owned? Is it like, which kind of needs does it have? Does it certify differently? It depends on which field does it operate. Is it business oriented? Is it who is your members oriented? Is it how big are you oriented? Is it, are you multi-located oriented? Or do you fulfill all the laws from all the countries you operate on? Or is it, there were so many questions coming to us when we were trying to identify the right answers to provide within such short periods. So yes, you're right. This is something that probably we considered as well. I don't know, Sadaf, if you want to add to that, because I was super interested.
No, I think Anna, you've covered most of it. I think the only question I would find myself asking is, what would set a cooperative type organization working in the education space, for the example you mentioned, apart from a different type of structure also working in the education space, in a way that would kind of create a need to have some kind of specialized education certification for cooperative organizations. So I think first we'd have to do the work of figuring out, like, how does the cooperative structure manifest in maybe a different approach to education that mandates a different type of certification from what's already out there for education organizations. And once we answer that question, then maybe we could, get further to the truth.
Fantastic. So want to be respectful of people's time. So it's 8 o'clock here in New York City. want to thank all the groups. It's of course, just like yesterday's sessions, we always felt like, well, this really calls for a marathon discussion, right? Maybe we should run a whole day of conversation on one of those topics in the future. So yeah, so thank you everybody. Thank you for all the work of the participants and the research sprint. Thank you for everybody who attended. Really grateful for that you gave us your time, and please tune in to the 2 remaining sessions today, and we can see each other there later today. And yeah, watch out for the outcomes and also for the documentation of all sessions. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah. 1 second, Sven. Okay, hi. Sven, you there? Oh yeah, there you are. Okay, hi.
I'm here. I'm just keeping on talking. Muted.
Yeah, good to connect.
Great session.
Yeah, great participants. I mean, these were. It's a very competitive process they had to go through, so it was great.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah, so you said it was a bit hard to understand, and
but you said something there about kind of financiation and not being an apex and a business model. So and then I felt that there might be, since Aman did the presentation for me, I think that there have been more of development of the ideas about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be at Mondragon for the next 7 months, right?
Yeah.
And so and frankly, they have also more expertise in thinking about the business side of that than I do. So I hope to learn from them of how to do that. But but we also really thought that still like a membership is a good base, right? And people like Sean Wellens and others have also said that membership fees are actually important, right? So that people also have a stake in it, right? And but like when I look at other organizations, I think they are mostly under-resourced, And when I look at, I just gave this TED talk, right? And when I look at TED, I mean, a ticket for TED is between $12,000 and $30,000, one ticket, just to be in the audience. Yeah. And but they do that so well, right? I mean, and it's because they have just a lot of money, right? And so I think if we want to do something really great, really well, then that will be needed. And so a combination of those two, I think, will be a solution.
Yeah, but how do of course, one of the issues around this, which causes going on in people's mind, and we also had a kind of discussion on it in some group of CCOP, which I was participating in, is that how does this relate to everything else in terms of CCOP and
Yeah.
ICA?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like, it was interesting. So we had the first meeting in Berlin, and people, like, we said, okay, there are all these needs, right? And there's a lot of urgency, and there are a lot of things that are not addressed, right? So like people's needs are not being met. But one thing that almost everybody said was that they feel well represented in terms of lobbying. So in terms of the policy work, right? They felt there was not an urgent need, because they felt like, yeah, I mean, you know, like CICOPA and CCOP and like all these groups are actually doing a decent job at pushing this. So that was interesting, right? So in a way, we immediately said, like, maybe this can be de-emphasized, right? We say basically like, well, so policy work is maybe, I mean, we are writing policy papers, but maybe they can be helping CCOP, right? And CCOPA to push this further, right? So because it's largely local too, right? So like Smart was saying that, well, you know, we do a lot of work in Belgium and with the EU, and it's really local work, right? You need to know the policymakers, and it's not really something like PCC or whatever we call this new thing can do, because it's not. What we can do is write policy. In fact, we wrote the entire last year. We wrote on a large policy paper that's coming out on December 6th. And so that's well, but so, you know, like you figure out, but I think like the need is mostly for coordination, right? For creation of working groups in these sectors, and that nobody else can really do, because they haven't been in this field like for like 7-8 years as we have. And so I think there's a sort of opportunity also to figure out, like I said just now, right, like to really make a business case for in those particular sectors, right? I think like it really needs some business acumen, and I hope to draw on Mondragon for that. Some people in Mondragon, when we gave the presentation, some people said we are fully behind it. So in our slide presentation, it said Mondragon is on their side, but then other people are not. So it's a mixture, as it always goes. So I don't know, but I hope to really draw on Mondragon's business expertise to bring that to this ecosystem, right? Because they obviously have that.
Yeah, but and how do you see? That's one thing which I also wonder. Also, what's this new member organization, and how is that related to the PCC consortium?
Yeah, that's difficult to figure out. I mean, so like Sean Vallon said, like the people, like how other apexes have started, right? Or call it whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Apex sounds a bit confrontational, right? Because it sounds like you're wrangling for some leadership. So maybe that's not the most skillful name, but one gets the idea, I guess, what we want to do. And Sean said essentially, like in the beginning, these organizations are led by, like the board is the people who founded it for the first 2-3 years, right, to get it off the ground. But then it turns into a completely democratic organization, and you just let go. You know, Sven, I don't even want to lead it, you know, to be honest with you. I mean, like that's not really what I want to do with my life. But I feel like responsibility in a way, because I see it's needed, it's urgent, and we are sort of in that place to do it, you know, and other people can take that over, you know, in like whatever after we sort of started it. But,
yeah, but yeah, and I suppose that also, of course there is a need of policy work in this field. I certainly think it is in many ways, and I think that somebody has to give credit fuel or what are needed, and to deliver that to organizations which are already involved in
exactly, yeah,
and also on national level in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and then there's this interesting development too, which I'm very, very excited about. That while I'm at Mondragon, we try to create like a sister institute at Mondragon, right? Like I'm charged with that, and so so I will try to really look at. So this will sort of double our strengths, right? Because we will look at our strengths at what we bring to the table. And obviously Mondragon has a lot and we have a lot. So like, and then we can see how we can complement this and create two partner organizations that do like in the research field, right? Unrelated to the apex, but how that can hopefully then inform with a strong emphasis on practice on Mondragon's part, and with the sort of strengths in the research side on our side. Yeah. So, and like, I mean, there's all this excitement, of course, like to to maybe like really try to model something that really cuts the bureaucracy and really creates tangible benefit for groups, and even monetary, because like if you look at, I mean, this is sort of also what motivates me, right? Because I see, like, I don't know if you remember Loconomics in San Francisco, and then you have Up and Go in New York. They did the same thing, right? And I mean, the guy in San Francisco spent $800,000 of his own money in time and fiat money to build this, when he could have used the software from Up and Go. But they wouldn't share it, so essentially $800,000 wasted just because people didn't collaborate, right? So I mean, this is what I mean by coordination. Like, like if somebody in Indonesia or like builds like a farming platform like they do, right? We are working with this group that works with quail farmers and tries to educate them and scale this model of urban quail farming to new young people. So it's sort of like an educational platform. Like, I mean, I'm sure there might be farmers in other countries who do similar things, or the fisher people in Mexico who start this data cooperative, right? Or the agricultural data co-op in Scotland that we are working with. Like all of these things, it's just they are not talking to each other. And so you have all this replication and all this waste of money, and it's they wouldn't even compete, right? I mean, like an agriculture group in Scotland wouldn't compete. Well, I don't know, maybe they do, but unlikely that they compete with somebody in Sweden. Right? Why couldn't they share the software? Why couldn't they share their insights?
No, but that's certainly important things, or at least using the same kind of standards. That means that you could share data, etc., and develop. If one goes down, then you can use that one instead.
Yeah, and the offer to, and then of course it was a question with the ICA, and so the way we came out on that is basically to say, like, well, our goal, our objective is to be a specialized group in the ICA. If you want us, right? I mean, so.
But in many ways, ICA is good. It sounds good, but in reality, I've never really. Also, I've been here for a long time, so I never understand. I never see very important things they do that delivers something to co-ops.
Fine, this I agree.
Now you're recording this one. Don't.
Oh my God! Yeah, no,